Well, so I had spoken with you both independently and together, and independently we came up with some techniques to try to use from Peter's book. And then together we were sort of exploring some ideas over the phone, and then I thought, oh, we got to stop that and do it on camera. So I think we can just kind of spitball to get the conversation going. In my experience, it usually takes a little while to kind of get a flow and get comfortable, but it usually does get there after a little while. So, Corey, I'm kind of curious if you have any initial thoughts on starting off.
Initial thoughts on starting off. I've been thinking about this conversation a lot and how to sort of, how do I want to position myself? What are the objectives in mind? And what always comes up for me is the objective should not be winning. It shouldn't necessarily even be bringing someone over to your side. It's simply getting at some consensus on truth. And that's how I want to orient myself off the bat. And I say that with the caveat that we don't even know exactly what the questions are. And I would imagine it's something that unfolds organically.
What are your thoughts? I know you were a little nervous, Eric, about the conversation, understandably, but I'm curious how you're feeling.
Well, I just had the problem of I didn't entirely know how I was going to come up with something that we would disagree on. So essentially, my only worry is that that one of us has to become a devil's advocate to some degree, like to make this potentially work. But I think that there's nothing wrong with that, and we should just, shoot for the moon. And if we hit the roof, yeah.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. It's something I've also been thinking about, in sort of like the degree to which one can come into a conversation assuming that the other person agrees with them, and how much of that was predicated on what I said in the initial interview that I had on this show, which was how quiet I've been about my actual views on a lot of these issues. And so I've sort of been disingenuous in that I've put people in a position of assuming that I have a perspective that I maybe don't have, and almost entrapped myself in that silence. And so I'm kind of thinking, in keeping with the objective of truth and understanding, how to break that ice in this conversation too, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. Well, having especially the varied upbringings that we've had, like, that don't make either of us necessarily like perfect candidates for people to quickly understand. Like, you coming from England, being a person of color, me coming from the South, but not being a conservative or really having much inherent racism, but having to deal with it in my life. Like, yeah, it's interesting because that would be the obvious way to go down and start having conversations, because people would probably already have certain preconceived notions about us, just knowing that, just by looking at us. But they're clearly not true, and we come from different places. So I think we could potentially use that, Travis, to like get us in a working space. And I mean, I think
what you said is a good idea. Like, let's give just a potted history. We kind of did that with Corey in the interview. So let's start with you, Eric. Where did you come from, and how did you find yourself in Portland?
Right. Okay. Fair. So initially born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. I lived there for most of my young life. Left at 18, went to college for a year, moved to Pittsburgh, moved to Philadelphia, moved to Brooklyn, traveled around the country, and eventually found myself in Portland, Oregon in 2000, which I would have been 21 when I arrived. But my family my dad's from California, from San Diego. My mom is a complete farmer's girl. They have a 1,000-acre farm on the Ohio River. My uncles, everyone in that sect, still farm there. That land has been not theirs, but they've been on it for 120 years. They're sharecroppers. But I mostly grew up in the city of Louisville. And
Yeah, so my background, not what one would expect. From the UK, grew up in a lot of different places because of the nature of my parents' work. So we were bouncing countries all the time, usually every 2 to 4 years. And citizen of the world, really, international background and upbringing. And I come from a mixed family. Because there is West African, there's English, there's Scandinavian, and there's German Jewish in my family. So it's just kind of like, oh, okay, I'm this weird amalgamation of all of these different experiences.
It's very British of you.
Well, I'm nothing if not cosmopolitan in that sense. But it's just strange being in the US and having the constant comparison to what people know of people with my skin tone here. It's a very specific experience. And then coming to Portland in 2010, even more of a culture shock. As I've always leaned heavily into individualism and trying to orient myself in a part of the country where people who look like me typically have a very specific set of experiences and backgrounds has been an interesting thing to navigate. It's interesting hearing about...
Out of curiosity, why do you say that as far as them having a very specific sort of...
I think it's because, people expect, blacks to sound a certain way, to dress a certain way, to carry themselves a certain way. There's a certain stereotype that I don't fit, never been interested in it. Whenever I travel, especially in Europe, no one cares. I'm just like, oh, are you English? Yeah, that's it. And then we end up talking about football for 15 minutes, and it's just like, that's the end of it. But in the States, it's very different because the experience is, you sound so white, you look so white, like the way that you carry yourself is completely different. And that is the biggest culture shock that I have to deal with on a daily basis here. It's interesting kind of hearing a bit about your background and this long, deep tie that you've had to a specific part of the country that also has a certain projected identity onto it. I feel like that might be a point of overlap between the two of us.
Yeah, probably. And because also like some of my family for sure fits stereotypes, like for sure. But it's difficult when you know somebody after like a long period of time. You learn that no matter what, stereotypes can be overcome, and you can't pinpoint it. But most of my mother's side of the family has some inherent racism in them just because of the culture that they grew up in. It's the lack of education. So it's not even hatred. It's just a confusion, really, about what they think other cultures and other races of people are. And it's just because they don't know. They have no idea. I mean, they have friends who are African American. They have friends who are Jewish. They say the most horrible words possible to describe them, but in like a really loving way. It's very confusing. Like,
that is interesting.
It's confusing as a kid because I grew up with my friends were in Louisville, were Filipino. They were English. They were from, there was a lot of Southeast Asian people I became really close with, and like those were my ties, and I really enjoyed the culture that they brought into my life and into Louisville, which is it's sort of cosmopolitan city, oddly, but like it doesn't have, its cultures are separated. So it was nice to have like a group of friends that were all like, I would, go to Filipino New Year's, and I would go to like British, like, the famous holiday that's basically Christmas over there. But
Boxing Day.
Boxing Day, yeah, thanks. And yeah, it was an interesting way to grow up, and then to go spend time in the summer working on the farms and working in tobacco fields and stuff, and having to, like, by the time I was a teenager, correct my uncles into being like, you can't use that term like around me. Please don't call it. That's not what you call people. And they would look at me like they almost didn't understand. Like they would be like, what do you mean you don't call it? I was like, no, you can't call them that. And they would be very confused about like the fact that was not, that most of the world thought that was a really horrible term. But it was just like by proxy of where they grew up, by being not surrounded by a lot of people, by spending no time in like urban populations or having like an education. And like once I learned that, it became easier to have a conversation with them about it. Once I like took that into consideration instead of just like being like, you guys are racists. It became, how do I teach you that like the history of the United States and the history of where that word comes from is actually like derogatory and terrible. And if you call somebody that, you might get punched in the face. Like,
That's interesting. There's so many things just kind of listening to you describe that.
Yeah.
That it opens up many avenues of questioning. I think what I'm sensing as you tell me more about your background and what you were exposed to, it sounds like you took on a degree of personal ownership for the language that you were around and the language that your family were using. And so I wonder if you feel that's true.
yeah, maybe ownership. I might have been too young to actually feel like I had ownership of like anything. But definitely some level of need to correct like a wrong that my family was perpetuating, like to basically put an end to it, to try and make whatever my generation was be like the wall of, terrible and fallible things that people have done like before me, just making an end. Like,
Right.
I thought I could pull that off. Not so much. I mean, it's really difficult to change people's minds. So, but I tried.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting to me because, and I've been trying to figure this out myself, because coming from a completely different cultural tradition where using that kind of language, derogatory terms for people by demographic, is almost a way of bonding with other people, because there's this kind of this social gamesmanship that happens where people are trying to kind of press your buttons a bit to see if you can be relied upon to zing them back, and then you know where you are in the social hierarchy, and you're like, okay, yeah, this person's on the level, they're fine, because they don't take things so seriously.
Yeah.
And so it's a huge head scratcher for me, because I find myself thinking, why is everyone so sensitive? And is it, maybe there's some historical differences that play into it, but getting a sense of why people feel a personal ownership over language and social issues broadly. Trying to understand the roots of that is something that I've been trying to get at, I think, for a long time. Because it's just so different for me. I don't feel any personal ownership in any way, shape, or form for past history.
Right. Well, and a lot of it could just be like, for instance, a white person totally taking the stance that like, or some sort of understanding that like, let's say the black population in the United States needs to have the opportunity to take back the culture that's theirs and make a culture that's theirs. That is just something that I came up with. I have no idea. I never asked a black person, like, how do I support you in reclaiming, your history from 200 years of slavery? Like, how does that work? I just made some assumptions and was like, this is what I'm going to do. And I think part of the thing that Travis is trying to eventually get to is like how, because we had talked about like, for instance, during the BLM movement this year, like taking photographs as documentation of it. Like, do I, as a person, as a 42-year-old white male, like have the right to publish those photos places and claim ownership in some ways because of being a part of it, is actually being a part of that movement and actually making some decisions. And I think that like when I started taking those photographs, it was not to exploit anybody. It was mostly just to document them, to be much like your father, just like a photojournalist, a person capturing history so people can refer to it at a later date. Like, but in the process of doing it, people got really upset, very upset at me. Like, I got yelled at a lot. I was like, people were asking me for money for photographs. Like, someone asked for like a roll of film from me. Like, it was not what I expected. And it took a lot of explaining. But I think part of the thing that maybe Travis wants to get at too is like, where do people have ownership in the world?
Yeah.
I know that's a really massive question, but it's like,
Yeah.
where do people give up who they are, and where do people begin taking ownership of other things like people, ideas? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that might be potentially one of the areas where perhaps we diverge a bit, is because and I'm just listening to to what you're saying. I think you're speaking in terms of more of a collective identity. You're talking about white people as a block, black people as a block, and I've encountered that language a lot, and I've always tried to wrap my head around it, because I think maybe by virtue of my upbringing, by virtue of my ethnic backgrounds, and just by virtue of what I've been exposed to, I'm a radical individualist. I've never been someone who fits cleanly into any category. I don't feel really an affinity with the black identity, because that's only part of my identity. And so because of that, I'm always fighting this battle for getting people to see me as just an individual. And so there you are, you're in this situation, and you're taking photographs, you're trying to objectively document something that's going on, and people are harassing you. People are maybe exploiting your presence there. You said they were asking for money. So I think my question is, really, how much of these social issues that we're talking about around stereotypes and racism, how much of that is in the realm of collectivizing identity groups, and how much of that is in the realm of individual one-on-one interaction, do you think?
You mean like, can you change effectively positions by having one-on-one interactions, as opposed to just like, I think I'm trying to understand what you're saying.
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, no, I guess what I'm getting at in my roundabout English overthinking way is, can you affect change by forget about identity categories and just deal with people as individuals? Why is it so difficult for us to just speak as Corey and Eric rather than as black guy, white guy?
Right. And I've had this conversation actually with like a prominent like female black activist in Louisville at one point, and similar conversation, at least. And she was basically like, everyone's an individual, but we all sort of define ourselves through our culture, through things through our upbringing. And for some cultures, it's a stronger connection than others. So some people, like, say from, the black population in West End Louisville, have found like a stronger connection because of the way that they've supported each other, like through some very difficult times and through racism in the area and stuff like that. So they have this connection to that culture that has helped them get through very difficult times, still believing themselves to be individuals, but part of it becomes like they also are so connected to it that it's difficult to separate themselves from like the greater whole of that culture. So I don't know if that destroys individualism. I don't know if it helps you define it more. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, well, I think so. Again, my goal is just kind of understanding from the perspective of someone who I think has a greater degree of proximity to these issues than I have, because I'm coming from such an outside perspective. I may as well be from Mars, kind of looking at all of this. And when I look at it objectively, I think to myself, okay,
Leeds, right?
Yeah, Leeds, definitely Mars. Yeah,
Totally Mars.
Exactly, completely, very alien place. Yeah. And so I think when I look at objectively, I see, when people talk about black culture, I say, well, what is black culture? Because you've got West Indian culture, you've got West African culture, you've got black South African, you've got black British. I mean, there's all these different variations of it. And then you have movements like BLM, who seem to think of this unified, holistic black identity that doesn't really exist, because they're speaking about a very specific experience of a specific demographic of black people in a very specific part of the world. And so when I see and experience that, I do feel very much that my individuality is threatened just by virtue of that argument being so massive in the cultural consciousness.
Right.
That makes
Essentially,
sense.
yeah. Essentially getting pigeonholed into a area of
Right. Yeah. You get assimilated into
something
the board
easy,
collective.
something easy to understand for everybody.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And I think, personally, it's extremely reductive, because really you have to understand people's individual experiences. The sort of there's the whole idea of the Miko system, which is just an old psychological concept from the 1970s around these different concentric circles of influence in a person's life, from their immediate familial environment, the kind of parents they have, the kind of neighborhood they grow up in, the kind of culture, the cultural milieu of the period, of a person's life. And we seem to have chucked all of that out in favor of this massive collective, you are black, therefore you think like this. You are white, therefore you think like this. And so the willingness of someone, and please don't let me tell you your experience, but I'm curious, really the willingness of someone, bringing it back to the idea of ownership, of someone to say, oh, I want to take some ownership over how my family talks about other kinds of people and groups, because there's a history in this country. Is how much of that is based in an individual will, and how much of that is based in, I'm taking on the mantle of a collective identity to absolve myself of association with this original sin of racism. I guess that's what I'm driving at.
Yeah, it's heavy. I'm not religious, which I think is also similar to what you're talking about, which is basically like a collection of people all identifying with one belief, essentially, which is religion. Whether it's organized or not, you still have people. Atheism to me is a religion because it's a very defined idea that people follow.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
so, which is similar, but I find it to be destructive, like typically. So I'm trying, Travis, I don't know if we're ever going to disagree on this. We're just sort of going down a really wonderful path of exploration, but I don't know,
Sure.
because we will eventually end up agreeing on this. I can tell you 100%.
So it sounds like maybe you both do agree that and I'm just clarifying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it is okay for you, Eric, to have taken those photos, or it is okay for Corey to tell, or let's say he's chronicling something else, if it's not related to his identity, that this is actually something that's fine to do.
I think so. Well, I believe in exploration, and I think it's probably the only way that humanity will actually be able to live together on this planet is by having the ability to actually explore each other's like the individuality, and then also the individual cultures that people like grow up in, because it is difficult to erase upbringing. Like, I'm not a full Kantian, but like experience is essentially what makes humans who they are. And trying to understand humans who have experiences that you haven't even begin to like imagine or begin to like understand or even consider, it can be very difficult. And that's why the book is actually interesting, because it helps you get into like those conversations with people. But it's funny because I don't know that they're impossible conversations. I think all conversations are possible. I think having the will and the understanding to like have those conversations is like where you start, whether you're good at having the conversation, whether you're good at the language you speak, which I'm not, like terrible English. But
You're doing well.
Your English is lovely. But like that's sort of the key to having a productive life, having conversations and understanding people, I think. Like,
Totally. Yeah. And another thing we talked about on the phone, unless Corey, you want to interject,
Not really interject. I mean, I think that the idea of does someone with Eric's background have the right to take photographs of BLM? That is definitely not an area where we're going to disagree, because I think too, how do I want to word this? I think that there's a degree to which the battle that we're having around storytelling, that's just in the broadest, crudest sense, there's a battle over the universal and who has the right to claim ownership of the universal human experience. It's a very postmodern battle that I see playing out. And I think that, as long as people are going into a situation with the intent of being as ethical and as objective as possible about taking photos, they have the right to be there. So that's definitely not an area where I feel any particular disagreement whatsoever. I find it appalling, frankly, that people associated with BLM felt that they had the right to dictate who can tell that story. And I think, tell me what you think.
Yeah,
No,
no, because I could actually play devil's advocate here, even though we know basically where I stand. But so do you think, how could the best way I could put this? So do you think that a person who might have no idea of what goes on in a culture, has not really explored it, has we'll call it a right, or the ability to tell the truth about that culture and about what's happening?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So just so I understand correctly, I'm going to make sure that I'm not mischaracterizing your question.
Sure.
Do I feel that there is an objectively definable right for a person A to go to culture B and to tell a truthful story about something that culture B is experiencing?
Without potentially understanding it.
Without potentially understanding it. I would have to say yes. I think that is a universal right. Because again, for me, as I think as human beings, as thinking beings, how else are we supposed to understand the world except to go out and put ourselves into a situation and observe and reflect on what we're seeing and try to make sense of it? We're sense-making, meaning-making creatures. And so I think maybe it's not necessarily a question of rights so much as it is a question of inclination. Okay, if this is something that human beings intrinsically want to do, what are the ethics around how we go about doing that? Seems to be the more, I don't want to say valuable, but more pressing question to my mind, if that makes sense. But I would have to say yes.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's hard for me to disagree, but I do understand in some ways why people have that question. Or feel like that. I think also people just generally need to find ownership over their existence in the world, and they dislike it when somebody else, especially they think someone who doesn't identify with them at all, is taking ownership over who they are in the world. Right. Like by taking photographs of them and projecting them places, or by taking video, and showing them screaming at police, or all these things that don't necessarily define them as a human being, just as a person there in the moment doing a thing. Yeah. So I understand it. I don't know how you go about correcting people's public appearance versus their private thoughts and experience.
Right.
Yeah. The only way to do that is to literally have conversations and know everybody.
Well, there's something interesting. I kind of want to break that down a little bit. Okay, so there's two things that come to mind. I mean, first is I'm wondering if we insert if you have something, please.
I just wanted to clarify, if I could, real quick, that basically what I'm talking about is prejudice.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
People will innately have prejudice about something when they see it, if they don't understand it, 100%. So, right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So bearing that in mind, I kind of think that where we're going is, you again, circling around the issue of ownership of oneself, ownership of one's perception of their own identity in relation to the world. going into a situation with the intent of photographing it, documenting it in some way, and telling your interpretation of a person's experience based on that observation. We also live in an age where we are saturated with media, we're saturated with images, you know, and where is the degree to which people are so overly concerned with their own optics that they are acting in a way to elicit a given response? How does that play into it as well? I mean, because if you go into a situation to document it, are you assuming necessarily that there's authenticity in what you're capturing? Because the moment you introduce a camera into a situation, you and I as professional DPs, we know this well. The moment you put a camera into a situation, you are imposing a point of view. And people are aware of that, and they can play up their presence in order to be perceived of in a way that will elicit a specific response. I wonder about that too. And so does that change the ethics of the situation? I'm trying to figure this out.
Yeah, because also I think people want to be perceived a particular way too. So it's about sort of maintaining your identity and having some control over it in what seems to be an uncontrollable situation. So to me, in some ways, I definitely understand why people are protective of it and they don't want to be, put up on something as a pedestal of right and wrong, as a person of violence. They aren't. Like, there's people really like to protect their own identities. I tend to think that people, if they want to do that, should never go outside. Because, like, you are who you are when you go out in the world and you do the things you do. And if that's what's captured, people can for sure misjudge it. You can be caught in the wrong moment. You could be yelling at someone on a phone in sheer joy about something amazing happening, and someone takes a photograph of you across the street and it looks like you're lambasting somebody. It's lots of ways to misrepresent things, but I think people just need to be more conscious about who they are out in the world and like how they want to represent themselves. And if someone's going to take a photograph of them, I mean, in a journalistic way, not in a, this is going to be the cover of Facebook or this is going to be like the new Versace ad. Like, if you're going to be out in the world, represent yourself. I feel like humans have become so particular about protecting their image because of social media. I think mostly, like, it's created this just such a firestorm of like, who's allowed to take my picture? Okay. Who's allowed to like own my image and who's allowed to use my image without my consent? And it drives me crazy because it's like, I don't know that a still image does more than just seeing a person on the street. Like, I don't know what the difference is really in my brain. Like, I know to me, images are just memories. So you can come up with memories at any point about anything. I have all kinds of misguided memories in my life because I misremember them. Like, it's impossible to have perfect memories for everything unless you have a photographic memory. So it's like, images are the same way. Like, I feel that way, but like, I get that people want to like protect that and they want to protect who they are in the world and protect what people see and consider them. But I don't know. I just think that like humans need to be the person that they want to be in the world. If that's the truth. Like, yeah.
No, it's interesting. I don't want to go too far into the weeds. There's a million things about that particular point that I would love to respond to and ask and unpack. Travis, I kind of want to appeal to you.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest a topic we touched on the phone a little bit, where it did seem, at least initially, you guys disagreed, which was diversity hiring. And so I'm curious.
Right. Sorry,
Eric,
Josh.
I already know Corey's opinion to some degree, but I want him to say it as well. But I'm hoping you guys can talk about that. And Eric, you seem to be for it. Is that correct, or can you explain your position?
The concept. So I think we were talking about it specifically within the film industry, only because it's what we both know. That so when you're talking about giving people opportunities based on their gender, based on their skin color, their culture. It's tricky for me also because like I am a 42-year-old white male who's had a lot of opportunities potentially that it's hard to say whether it just came out of sheer will and work, which I worked very, very hard to get where I am, but those opportunities might not have been available to me if I was, you know, a black man from Tennessee or a black woman from Atlanta. Not difficult to say. I know for a fact I've had more opportunities probably given to me than those people. And when it comes to things like diversity hiring, essentially picking somebody because you want to give them the opportunity that they haven't potentially been given before, and it's less based on whether or not they're skilled and more based on who they are. I'm generally for it only because I think if it helps humanity become better at dealing with it and dealing with it earlier on, I think we're at a point where this is what we have to do. We have to start giving everybody opportunities. It does make it difficult to lose opportunities also based on the fact that you are a particular gender and have particular skin color and stuff. But there's a lot of people, and at some point, like, diversity also needs to be quality, and I don't know how to do that except for actually doing it.
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot, and I've been trying to figure out because I've been impacted by it in so many ways, and it's caused a tremendous amount of self-doubt in my own life. I mean, the degree to which I am hired onto a show because I'm actually good at what I do, or because there's a quota that needs to be filled and I happen to tick off a few boxes. I always end up kind of going home at the end of the day and just thinking to myself, do these people really respect me as a professional, or am I helping them feel like good people because they're, helping out someone who's in a lower social stratum? At least that's what they're assuming, and I think one of the things that comes up for me is, first off, have we even ever, as a culture, had a conversation around the actual benefits of diversity? I mean, does it really make an organization better to have a diverse staff, just intrinsically? And I'm talking about the token diversity of skin color and gender and things of that nature. If everyone has the same bloody skill set, what difference does it make?
Yeah. Do people get a chance? I understand that. Do people get a chance, though, to get that skill set if they're not given the opportunity? I think is the reality, like, that a lot of people don't get the opportunity. Like, you're extremely talented, like, and you're very good at your job. And I hope people don't hire you based on what the only thing I can think of is out of pity, essentially. And I don't think anybody should ever be hired out of pity. But I do think that there's certain innate things that happen in this country, specifically the United States, that prevent people from getting to a position where they can actually be and have the same talent that, like, everyone else in the organization might have. Like, if the rest of the organization is, let's say, 40-year-old white males. And also, diversity might actually help, because it might actually make the company grow in a different way. Like, if you have different viewpoints, different cultures involved in, like, an organization, sometimes it becomes like a much more leaner, faster, reliable machine than, having the same sort of group of, like, I just have to go back to it, just white men, like, running a thing. Like, I think if you can look at our federal government, like, and prove that that's
Yeah. Well,
true.
It's interesting. Not to cut you off. I wanted to sort of respond to something that you were saying, just in terms of demographics within organizations. When I think about my own professional experiences working in the industry for 22, 23 years now, and I think to myself, every single person who's ever hired me for anything has been one of those 40-something white males. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, if these are the monstrous demons of your as they've been made out to be by the wokeists, how is it that every single time I'm getting hired onto a show, it's some white guy who believes in my capabilities, who digs my show reel, loves my resume, and has an understanding that, hey, this guy's a good fit for what we're trying to do, end of story. And is that just because of the way the demographics have shaken out? I'm trying to understand that. I don't really have a sense of why that is.
Right. I think because you talked about this when we were having the conversation. It was the sort of over wokeness of the U.S. and the problem with that. I think it would have to be. I think you'd need to find individuals who didn't grow up with any real opportunity and ask them the same question. I'm not like a good person to ask because I had plenty of opportunities growing up, but like I do know people that didn't, and they still aren't in a position where they like got to like be the artist that they wanted to be, or have an opportunity to do things. And lots of people won't, but like diversity is such a really strange way of talking about inclusion. Like, because I don't know that you need to have like diversity. I think you just need to not have prejudice.
Right.
Like, which is the problem. Because then you could look at somebody who is of a certain color, of a certain gender, of a certain like identity, and like look past it and just look at whatever that they can provide. Like, and this includes like in school, like growing up, education, like the busing, all these things that like ruined entire generations of people and gave them poor educations and therefore put them in like certain workforces. And it's like a history in the United States, really terrible things that we've done to certain populations to keep them from getting ahead. And maybe it's because I grew up like Catholic and white that I just inherently say sorry constantly and just always feel like I have like guilt, which I'm easy to admit. Like maybe it feels like if there's something I can do to help support all the people that I didn't personally step on, but may have stepped over in the process, like not knowing it, like I would want to, because I don't like hurting human beings. So if like someone looks at me and says like, I'm a black female in the industry and I've for sure been turned down for jobs because people don't think I'm capable of doing the work. And it's for sure not true. Like, of course I will hire her. Because she needs the opportunity, like, and because she is very good at her job. And I will consider her over a white male who I know works, like, and is working, like, and, has more opportunities to get ahead already. But I don't know when that stops. I don't know when it turns to the other side and all of a sudden white males no longer have opportunities to work. And like, I don't really care so much, which is strange to say, but like what I think is just like, how do humans get to a point where we don't pay attention to these prejudices and just let people hire whoever they want to hire?
There's a lot I want to sort of respond to there. I'll respond to the statement that you just made. I think for me, it's more of a focus on merit than on immutable identity characteristics. I can't bloody well help who I was born or where I grew up or my cultural identifications, but I can help my professionalism, my work ethic, my skill set, how I present myself on the job. And those are the things that I want to be measured on, not any other intrinsic characteristics that I may have. I do want to circle back, if you don't mind, to one thing, because you're talking a lot about people being given or not being given the opportunity to do certain things or to have certain positions. There's two things that come to mind when I think about that. And the first is, Well, why are we assuming that someone who has a skin tone like mine necessarily comes from a position of underprivilege? Because I certainly didn't. I grew up upper middle
Oh
class.
yeah, no, I think it's mostly just that's just the easiest term for our viewing audience to, or like easiest like thing to identify quickly. So
Right.
I mean, we could go through all of the like various forms of things that the U.S. has done to to different sects of people throughout the globe, as far as like stamping them down and not giving them a chance to like perform well. But yeah,
Right, and I get that. I think this is something I find myself really strongly disagreeing on because, I mean, certainly compared to what? I mean, compared to Sierra Leone, it's just like, I feel like, if I'd been born there, I would not have the opportunities that I've had in the U.S. In as much as I've had issues in the States, to a lesser degree than I have in other parts of the world, like Europe, where it doesn't really seem to matter as much, oddly enough. But I think about,
why do you think that is?
well, I think that that's mainly because it's a much older culture and Europe is extremely diverse. I mean, this is something that Americans don't really get. Even before you had the influx of immigrants from other parts of the world, you'd have a different mindset between a Frenchman and a Swede, and so when you have these different language groups, these different ethnic groups that had feudal ties going way, way back, there is this just sense of, yeah, you're slightly different from me, and I can kind of make fun of you, and you can kind of make fun of me, and we can find some common ground and just get on with it because we have things to do. I find that, at least from the American perspective, what I've experienced, people just look at Europe and they're just like, oh, it's it's a bunch of white people, there's no diversity. Well, that's not true. If you actually know something about the history of that region of the world, there's a tremendous amount of diversity there and cultural differences. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, yeah.
It's sort of circling back to this idea of the appeal to history. That's something that always kind of gets my back up a bit because I think to myself, okay, yes, this country has the history that it has, but if you go far enough back into history, you're going to get the same perpetual cycle of colonialism and slavery everywhere you go. It's just different human beings doing it to other different human beings. And so what is unique about the United States that makes that so pernicious that we have to have a completely different mindset around opportunities here? And then the other part of that is the idea that people need to necessarily be given opportunities rather than striving in and of themselves to build up and cultivate the value to take those opportunities or create those opportunities for themselves. There seems to be a divergence in mindset, at least with regards to, I think, what you can broadly call the Black civil rights movement in America, where you've got the sort of Booker T. Washington school, which is very much do it yourself, be an entrepreneur, go off, have your own businesses, have your own thing as a Black person, and be self-sufficient. And the W.B. Du Bois school of thought, which is very much, we need help, we need external forces to save us from ourselves. And I see this conflict playing out, certainly in the realm of diversity hiring, to bring it to the microcosm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, because I lean more towards your thought. Like, of course, nobody necessarily wants to be just handed anything. Like, everyone should strive to be like, if they want to do a job, to do that job and do it well. I still, only just from personal experience, like from friends that I have, from people that I know, like, am just so keenly aware that those experiences are offered to certain people in certain circumstances and not to others.
Okay.
And I think part of the diversity hiring is people trying to rectify that problem.
Okay.
It's the only way to put it. Like,
Sure.
It's a problem for sure. But like, people, especially in the southern United States, like, there are, like, for instance, like Kentucky, Louisville has a 50% Black population. It is less racist then it is sexist. And man, is it sexist. Like, my mother worked for Colonel Sanders at the Kentucky Fried Chicken Corporation before it got bought by Pepsi. He was a horrible sexist and a racist, but mostly he did not like promoting women. He did not want them sitting on any of his boards. Like, there is a real thing that happens in this country where people of power tend to try and keep it with people that they agree with. And it's difficult to get them to see the broader picture of so if women, for instance, are being constantly denied a place at the table, if they're offered one, if you can offer one, that if I'm, say, hiring a crew of people for my shoot, if I have a chance to give somebody a chance to sit there and be a part of it and be creative and do the work that they've been hired to do, it's very hard for me, just coming from and watching my mother struggle her entire life, being denied raises and being denied certain positions in a company. Part of me wants to rectify that, and I don't know if that's the right way to go about it. I would love your opinion on it, actually, but it's just something it's innate in me where it's now I feel that if I can be a part of assisting and changing that, I want to be, but I don't know necessarily if there's a correct way of going about it. I think you're right. Obviously working, striving, doing your best to get to the position. But if there are inherent things in the way from you, if there's just a wall that stops you, you have to get rid of the wall.
Just building off what you were saying, I mean, you're sharing your mother's experience. I don't know if you can give me a decade or a time frame when this was
So the
happening.
70s through the 80s.
70s through the 80s. Okay. So putting it on a scale, okay, we're talking about the 1970s, 1980s. Clearly, there's a long period of time that's passed since then. And
Scale
so
thing. I love
on a
this
scale
one.
of 1
Great.
to 10, how much would you say that issue of barriers to entry for people of, I hate using this phrase, but I'll use it anyway, diverse backgrounds. On a scale of 1 to 10, how prevalent do you think that remains now in 2021?
I'd have to make it up because I'm not part of that that diversity. I don't exist in that. I can understand it and I can talk to people about it, but it doesn't affect me like it affects them. And
sure.
people will always tell me different things than what they actually are. As far as let's say if someone's going to hire me and I'm wouldn't you like to hire Sika? I mean, she's a really good shooter. She's, if they say no and I ask a question why, they're not going to tell me it's because I'm a white male. They might have their other reasons, but they'll find some reason that I'm the right person for the job, even though Sika might be better at it than me and might be more talented than me and might actually be that's what she does. She shoots documentaries. You should hire her.
Yeah.
Or speaks the language. If it's going to a foreign country, I got off track a little bit, but
it's okay. Yeah, no, I get the sense that you feel passionately enough about it to be able to assign some sort of value measurement to it, right?
it's sort of, so, I mean, it's only because I don't actually have, it doesn't affect me like it might affect someone else. So my mother might say that it's gotten better and it's a 6 out of 10 if 10 being the worst.
10 being the worst, yeah.
And me, I might be oh, I see actually a lot more opportunities today. We have a female vice president. We had a female run for president, et cetera. So, maybe a 4 out of 10. So perspective oriented though, I don't know if it's the truth.
Oh no, of course. I mean, it's all subjective, really.
Right.
I mean, that's what we have. We try to be objective, but it's that I don't know that that's ever really achievable.
I mean, the number system is actually because I remember reading it in the book. It is a really funny and almost oddly accurate way of going about judging the severity of something you might be talking about. I think it's important, but it's also very hard to put numbers on personal experiences. So, but yeah, sure. Let's say for me, diversity hiring, the problem of, I mean, I still think 7 out of 10.
Okay. And why do you think you're not a 6?
Interesting. I think only because I've seen it affect people so much over like my life. And also because, I mean, I do work in an industry that like historically has mostly been men. And for 100 years, mostly white men. Like, so it's definitely been diversified over like a period of time. And I'd love at some point, even outside of this conversation, to talk to you about like diversity and why it's not necessary. But yeah, I think I don't know how to write what like our parents and our generations like before them have done as far as like putting people into positions, disempowering them essentially, like by stripping them of like their right to be better than they should be, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I get that. I get that. I mean, I know that it comes from a place of genuine compassion and conscientiousness for other people. And it's helpful for me to sort of understand those motivations because I always, and maybe this is just my own baggage really, but I always seem to experience it in people as this kind of moral narcissism, this kind of idea of, oh, I want to feel like a good person, so I'm going to go help these darkies over here. You know, it's just kind of this new white man's burden. You know,
Totally.
That's
Yeah.
often how I see it, which I recognize has its limitations and can be a bit reductive. No, go ahead.
Do you think it's only white people doing it though, or?
I think that certainly within the context of Portland, yes.
Right.
You know,
I mean, yeah, fair.
Certainly not in a global sense.
92% white. Yeah,
Right,
sure.
right.
Yeah.
And certainly any major kind of metropolitan area that's going to be very, very liberal, very progressive. Yeah, you're definitely going to see, I think, a white majority that has those views. But I don't know. Honestly, I really don't know. Mainly because of the circles in which I move. And I've recognized that might be the fog of war around which I'm trying to navigate these issues too, because of who I exposed to, who my friends are. The thing of it is, if I've only ever had one black friend my whole life, and that is a bit of a blind spot for me because being able to identify in any personal way with the ubiquitous black culture in a broad sense, that's always eluded me because I was never included or accepted by them. You know, certainly having a Jewish heritage, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the black community, as it were. And so I've been alienated from that side of the equation as well. And so being able to kind of understand experiences from that perspective has always kind of eluded me. A lot of our conversation has been around ownership of identity. And I'm trying to understand, okay, what does that mean to own an identity, to own a black identity, to own a white identity? What does that mean? What is the value of that? And why does that supersede the individual agency of just owning yourself?
Yeah, I mean, identity is a construct as much as like race is. I mean, it's not like something that actually exists. It's just something that humans have made up in order to be able to explain themselves. And in some ways it helps people, I feel like, get to a point faster. if you can have like a chapter heading essentially of like where you're coming from, sometimes that helps people get there faster, which may not be a good thing. Like it may be a terribly destructive thing. Because then again, you're not looking at the individual, you're looking at construct that the individual might take part in or be part of, or what you assume might be a part, or what your assumptions of it are. Like I have lots of friends from varying backgrounds, and they are not at all what people would think of when they think of like the race of those people. Like, they're not, they might identify, they might have family, they might all sorts of things, but they are not easily put into like little tiny boxes that are colored certain ways that you can just put places. So I feel that's true with every single human being.
So excuse me. So building off of that, the identity construct, what it means to come from a certain cultural group. We attach stories, we attach narrative to that. There's what Tom Sowell has talked about with the Jewish experience in America, which I know something about personally. I mean, I have a German and Austrian Jewish lineage to a degree. Certainly if you're marginalized, you have to adapt to that situation of marginalization. So why is it you have one population that says, okay, well, we're not really wanted. We've always not been wanted wherever we are, so we're going to cleave to our own traditions. We're going to take care of each other as people. We're going to start our own businesses. We're going to do our own thing. And out of that arises a certain degree of prosperity. And we see this happen in the United States in a lot of different communities, but it doesn't seem to have happened with the Black American community nearly to the same degree. And there are a lot of theories and narratives being thrown around why that is. Of course, everyone wants to tie it to the legacy of slavery, which, okay, certainly to a degree that is part of it. But you also have a situation where, and Sowell has pointed this out in numerous books and articles over the years, you had a tradition of intact Black families and Black prosperity in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, during a period of time when certainly racial prejudice was far more pernicious and overt than it is now. So how is it that people could be doing better during a period of time when things are ostensibly worse than during a time when things were supposed to have improved? And this is something that I've always been trying to kind of suss out. And the last thing I want to add to that, I know I tend to make very broad, big statements, is this idea that with regards to something like BLM, or we'll just say the woke Black activists of today, so much of the Black identity is tied up in victimization, is tied up in, you can't tell the story of the Black experience, trademark, inverted commas, because that's our story. We need that for our sense of ourselves as an identity group. And that's just something that I think is extremely destructive, personally.
Well, two questions. Did you grow up Jewish?
Yeah.
Like in the religious, like, yeah.
Yes.
Did you stop being Jewish at some point?
The interesting thing about this is with my mother, she'd lost her mom when she was very young. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, she had kind of a break with any sort of spiritual tradition. And as I got older, just kind of said, figure it out.
Right.
You go do your thing, be yourself, be who you are. And so for me now, it's much more of a philosophical mindset and a part of my ethnic identity than it is any sort of practicing religious identity, because I've drawn from a lot of other traditions as well to sort of encompass my holistic spiritual view. But it is a part of myself that is meaningful to me.
But you still hold parts of the philosophy of like the Jewish religion as a thing?
Yeah.
So when you talk about the destructiveness of like people identifying their past culture potentially, or being like hanging on to it, do you think that can also be translated into people that say identify with like Italian Americanism or like Jewish Americanism? Like, do you think hanging on, I guess I also want to try to figure out where in the conversation identity, like if we're talking about religion and people identify with that, like does that also like to you, like is that a destructive thing to hang on to?
You mean religion specifically?
Well, no, not necessarily specifically, but like if we're talking about, you sort of got to like talking about Black Americans and how they specifically, especially the like woke BLM movement, how they want to hang on to the oppression of slavery as something a part of their past to try and rectify the rest of the population, to acknowledge and take care, fix essentially at this point. Like, and you said that that's sort of destructive. Do you feel the same way about like other sort of groups of people that have been marginalized and otherwise, like Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Japanese Americans? Like, do you think that it would be better if everybody sort of erases that past, that like need to have some sense? I think I know what you were saying about like other cultures have managed to move forward faster in your mind than like Black Americans have, because of potentially them holding on to this. It's not a grudge, it's impossible, but holding on to this past of slavery in the United States. Do you think that everybody should, like, do you think that spans across all things, like as far as history goes, like specifically religion, marginalized groups, things like that? Do you think they should all?
Sure. Well,
I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit. But.
No, it's great. It's great. No, it's a wonderful question, and I'm chomping at the bit to answer it because for me personally, I don't think that moving beyond your history means that you have to erase it. I think that it's incredibly dangerous what has been advocated by certainly some circles, the idea that we just ignore the past and we move forward and we don't look at the things that have happened. No, you absolutely must know the past. You must know history. You must know different interpretations of history in order to facilitate that moving forward. But I think the difference between, at least that I see, Black Americans and perhaps Japanese American whose grandparents were interned during the Second World War is that I don't see Japanese Americans saying, "Oh, my grandparents were interned and it was just a horrendous thing, and in order for me to feel secure in my identity and secure in who I am as a person, I need that to be acknowledged." No, they recognize that it's a part of their history, it's a tragedy, it never should have happened, and they move on. And I just don't see Black Americans doing that to nearly the same degree. So no, I think you could acknowledge the past. I think you have a duty to acknowledge history, but you also have a duty to attain some self-actualization and move forward.
I do have a question as to, do you think that it's possible that people haven't let Black Americans move on? That like they were more ready to let like the Japanese Americans, the Chinese Americans, like people who were also like marginalized and even enslaved at some point in the US, like to move on, but that like the rest of the country and the culture of the US just hasn't allowed Black America to move forward? Or do you think it's actually Black America preventing itself from moving forward?
I think there's some aspect of both going on. I think that there is a degree to which the Black American culture has very much entrenched itself in the narrative of slavery, in the victimization, but I also think there's a degree to which that's been encouraged and exploited by the culture, certainly by the more, shall we say, liberal, progressive culture, which profits off of that victimization as a way to buttress its own power and its own wealth. And there is a vicious cycle playing out between the Black Americans who cleave more to the victim identity and the people who set themselves up and do very well out of that grievance. So I do see it becoming more of an industry than a legitimate moral argument, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Putting it as an industry is pretty spot on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'd agree on that, Travis.
Yeah. Yeah,
He did clarify a couple of things. I just wanted to, because
Sure.
which was great.
And I just wanted to say too, I mean, really, for me, it just comes down to agency. I mean, I understand that it might seem very compassionate to say, oh, well, have Black Americans been prevented from attaining goal X? But also, why are we not giving the Black American community the same moral agency as everyone else? That's another aspect of the conversation that I don't really see being talked about in mainstream circles. And I'm not the first person to bring this up. I mean, going back to Thomas Sowell is something that he's talked about at length.
I was just going to ask Corey
Yeah.
if you think your opinion on these issues, since you didn't grow up here, is in any way limited, or I mean, it sort of ties back to the original conversation of where everyone grows up and their cultural experience, et cetera. How do you factor that into your assessment? I'm curious.
Yes, I feel that just because of my background, where I come from, and my lack of proximity to people on the ground who've been affected by the history of racism in America, I feel my perspective is absolutely limited, and this is something that I've argued with people about frequently. I've recognized how much I don't know really about that experience because it's not my own. And I do have a degree of distance from it, emotional distance from it, because my experience has been so different. And so that's why I really just kind of want to understand.
Would you say you'd never experienced it?
Experience what is it?
Sorry, I'm going to have to define that a little bit better. Would you say you've never experienced any sort of racism based on your color of your skin? Like
I have, but I've experienced it mainly from white liberals. That's my experience.
Yeah.
Because the way I've experienced it has always been someone saying something to me like, "Oh, you sound really white," or "You present yourself very white,"
Gotcha.
as if in order to be authentically Black, I have to dress a certain way, sound a certain way, carry myself a certain way. That's the kind of racism I've experienced. The other kind of racism I've experienced, I think, more frequently is the assumption that I'm of lower ability or a lower degree of education or less capable than a white person would be for a given job. I've definitely experienced that. The instances of visceral, in-your-face racism as it's often characterized have been few and far between. I won't say that I haven't
you mean like
experienced
derogatory racism, essentially?
Oh, sure. No,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I've had the odd, white person spit on my shoes and give me a nasty look, but I can count those instances on one hand. And those things don't affect me on a personal level because, as far as I'm concerned, it's just an idiot being an idiot. I don't have to internalize it as anything more than that. The racism that is far more threatening to my prospects in my life and my own self-actualization is coming from people who think that because of my skin tone and the way that I look, that I have to be treated differently. And that shows up in the professional environment. That shows up in how I'm regarded in terms of my ability. That's the dangerous racism that I'm worried about, personally.
Right.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just point out.
Well said, by the way.
That's just.
Yeah.
Just that while you admitted your perspective is limited because you didn't grow up here, et cetera, you're certainly not the only, you referenced Thomas Sowell. There are certainly a number of Black conservatives and even liberals and progressives that actually don't go along with that more victimization mindset that you were describing. And John McWhorter is one of them, and he feels sorry for people who have occasionally just been racist to him, considered him less than, or maybe even used the N-word. I mean, he's in his 50s, so he's experienced more of that. But he feels sorry for them, and that plays into what you were talking about, Corey, this idea of like, okay, well, how can we overcome this and move beyond? So I think that's interesting. I just wanted to throw that out there. So I had one more potential topic. I think that Corey and I, maybe we discussed this, or maybe it was in our interview, I don't remember, but If you don't like it, we can try to choose a different one. But I remember, Corey, you talking about what some people claim in terms of, and I'm not putting this on you, Eric, but I'm curious what you think about it. How many unarmed blacks are killed by the police, and what is that based on, that information? And I think that's a really interesting thing to explore, because the current movement rides off of that and a certain belief about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're going to have to explain yourself a little bit better, though, because it's a very sensitive topic. And
Sure.
because I would answer that almost immediately by saying, like, the statistics of how many police officers have killed unarmed black men. You could just go off that. But
Yeah.
if you're talking about fudging statistics, there's going to have to be some sort of proof of that to have a reasonable conversation about it. So.
Right. I also kind of want to add to that, again, and this might tie into the discussion that we were having earlier around the particulars of the racist history of the United States and the degree to which that continues to be made relevant. And I always find myself thinking about these instances and thinking, why are we not just talking about police brutality as a whole? Why is it specifically race and policing that seems to be the timbre of the discussion, if I'm making any sense?
Yeah, I think, 100%. And I think I know where you want to go with it, but I think the reason it becomes a bit point of discussion is because they can continually make it a point of discussion. And having come from the city of Louisville, where I've had friends wrongly arrested, I've had friends that have had drugs planted on them, I've had friends in Black West End Louisville had entire forces of police pull guns on them for walking down the street. There is a real thing that happens in the United States as far as being assumed that you have done something wrong because of the neighborhood you live in, which is mostly due to the color of your skin, too.
Yeah. And again, I definitely want to make clear my own limitations in this regard, because my experiences have just been so vastly different that I always feel somewhat unqualified to really comment.
What drives you to wonder the facts around police brutality in African Americans specifically?
Yeah, I think what drives me to ask that question really is fundamentally my own spidey sense that goes off, which is just, okay, whenever someone brings up the racial question, I feel like I'm being manipulated. And I recognize that's not an argument. That's pathos, not logos, right, that I'm coming from. But I'm instantly looking out for the manipulation, because of the degree to which the media seem to constantly harp on the issue of police brutality having an intrinsically racist component. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Of course it does. But the broader questions around police brutality as a whole, as it affects citizens of the United States, seems to be lost in the fog of the racial component. I think that's my motivation for asking.
Right. Do you think it has to do with the fact that more Black Americans experience police brutality than any other group? Do you think there's another group that experiences the same amount of police brutality and therefore deserves to have the same level of thought and accountability put into the discussion?
I wonder if it's a fact that Blacks experience more police brutality. I think if you look at it relative to population density and demographics and just the overall ethnic makeup of the country, I mean, the latest average is that Blacks are about 13% of the population. So really, it's engagements with the police by demographic, by proportion, really, of the population that I think is, and I wonder about the degree to which that's getting distorted in the conversation, because surely if whites are the majority of the country, they're going to have more interactions with the police just by virtue of having a larger population set. But the degree to which those engagements are necessarily more or less brutal, I'm not sure how that can be quantified.
Do you think that point, though, might be like the fact that only because if they are 13% of the population, whites are a larger percent of the population, that they would inevitably have more interactions with police? Do you think that that's possible?
I think
That- that-
I think
that
that's
it's not
possible.
true? I mean, sorry, do you think it's possible that they don't? That whites have inevitably less interactions with the police because the police force tends to have some sort of inherent racism built into it, that policing black neighborhoods, policing black projects, policing like those communities is done more on a regular basis than policing white communities?
I would say that it is absolutely possible. I wonder, though, is this pursuant to race or class? Because are we talking necessarily about solely the racial demographic of a given area, or are we also talking about affluence, wealth?
Right.
You know,
Potentially both, but I think since it comes back to brutality, I think it might come into the question of, let's say you have a population of poor whites and a population of poor blacks, and they both live roughly in the same area in a city. They might be separated by like a main thoroughfare or something. Like Louisville has like West 9th Avenue separates the black projects and the white projects, and it's sort of changed over the years, but they were very specific. Like they used to shoot at each other from across the street.
Yeah.
The police definitely treated the same class of people with white skin differently than they treated the same class of people with black skin. Mm-hmm. And that can be shown in numbers just by the sheer number of arrests, convictions, imprisonment, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It also does beg the question too of like, does that, if it is potentially a class thing, like you're saying, like, does that mean that black Americans are typically in a lower economic class for potentially racist reasons? Mm-hmm. And does that then put them in a position to be closer to dealing with cops and being brutalized by them?
Yes, I would say that it does. And I would also add to that also there's a perception as well that a given black person is going to come from that demographic and therefore can expect to be treated a certain way by the police. I think that's valid.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I throw out an idea that maybe might be worth talking about? So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the economist Roland Fryer. He happens to be black, and he was looking at the numbers, and he's done actually several papers on this now. And his work did find that black and Latino suspects, particularly men, tended to be roughed up more, but actually shot less. So whites were tended to be killed more, interestingly. And he said that was the most bizarre finding, and he did not expect it at all. So I think he's one individual, but there are other studies like this, and I think that's an interesting point or question.
There's something I can just add to that real quick.
Yeah.
I guess bringing it back to two specific instances, and Eric, I'd be curious to know what you think about this. There's the narrative around what happens to George Floyd, which obviously was absolutely horrifying and despicable and should never have happened. At the same time, there is a lesser-known case of a white gentleman in Texas named Tony Tempa who died the same way. That did not garner any media coverage whatsoever. There certainly weren't riots about it. So the degree to which you have two cases, which I'm not saying are necessarily identical, just that the specific circumstances in which they died were so similar that they could be discussed in the larger context of police brutality as a whole, that everyone in the population potentially could find themselves subject to in the right set of circumstances. Right. And yet, the way it was discussed had this racial overtone in the case of George Floyd.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's and this I could be proven wrong, but from what I if I make an assumption about what's happening, it would be that the person, I don't know how many percentage of white people you're talking about, Travis, when you say like were killed.
It was proportional to the crimes committed.
So it's all proportional. Okay, great.
Okay.
I don't. So I can't imagine if more whites are killed by police wrongly, that doesn't come up more often. It's difficult for me to understand. How can I put this? In the last 10 years, I mean, really in the last 100 years, but in the last 10 years specifically, the number of crimes that have become very public displays of brutality by the police have almost always been to either Black or Latino men, and women in some cases with like Breonna Taylor. But I feel like it builds. Like, I feel like you already have a population that feels like they're being subjugated to a certain degree because of their class and because of their skin color. And then once you start murdering those people without going through the process of law, like putting people in prison, going through the being judged by people and your peers, if you just start murdering them, it seems like everybody should be infuriated, whether you're Black or white or whatever. But the Black population has had very public displays of murder by police, and that shows up. And that's why when you have someone like George Floyd murdered publicly for the entire world to see, like, that crossed a line. Like, the lines have been crossed so many times already, but that pushed people over the edge, I think. And
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a part of me that definitely
it pushed white people over the edge too. Like,
Yeah. I think that's very evident in what we've seen happening in the streets of Portland, because certainly a good percentage of those demonstrators, we'll just call them that, are not Black. They're white.
most of them are not Black.
Yeah. There's something interesting about that, to kind of build off what you're saying, that I'm trying to figure out as well, is so we're very well versed in narratives. We know how images can be spun and how context can be massaged or adjusted to elicit a certain emotional response. You know, this is drawing from the rhetorical tradition of pathos. And what we consistently hear, and I hope I'm building off your point, I'm not trying to diverge in any way.
No.
Is this repeated phrase, unarmed Black man. And I think a lot of people don't really stop and think about what that means. Unarmed doesn't necessarily mean not dangerous and not a threat. Because if you're dealing with someone who is 350 pounds and maybe they're hopped up on PCP or have other substances in their bodies that lower their pain resistance or prevent them from functioning in a more grounded way, they can certainly present a danger to someone who is 200 pounds. And so it just seems, and I recognize that I'm using language like it just seems, and I think that, which is not in any way, shape, or form an argument. I just wonder about the degree to which this idea of them being unarmed means that they're not presenting a threat, that an officer in a stressful situation with only seconds to act to save his own life or the life of someone nearby might have to draw and shoot in order to preserve life.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the key, well, I'm going to make assumptions too. Like, I think the key to the whole unarmed thing is completely unarmed. Like, they're not wielding a baseball bat or a stick, a knife. They might have their fists. They might be completely erratic. They might be a danger, but there is something, if you're going to arm a police force, the fact that they don't know how to use them to simply incapacitate somebody instead of shooting them 18 times in the chest is a real problem. And that's, I think, what people that's why unarmed comes up so much, is because it's not that they're slowing them down or putting them in a position where they can like handcuff them and then take them to prison and then, or to jail and then have them go through the judiciary system. It's like they're just murdering them. They're like not shooting them once in the leg. They haven't been trained to shoot them once in the leg. So you have a police force that's trained to react, to overreact, which ends up in a lot of cases with dead bodies on the street. Like,
How many cases do you think that is? Or go ahead.
how you mean compared to how many? So I don't know. I can tell you that when I was out of high school in Louisville, I was part of a cop watch program that Angela Davis set up. And we were essentially like, had to sit on Friday and Saturday nights at our home with a police scanner and then a video, like at this point it was like mini DV, I think. And you basically listen for the police scanner. You listen for 4 different codes that were traffic stops. And you listened for the term black male ages 18 to 45. And as soon as you heard that, you would get in the car and find them on the side of the road and drive there and sit there with the police, with the video camera rolling. Because at that point, about twice a week, the police were shooting black men in traffic stops in Louisville. Like, they were killing them at an incredible rate. Like, and some of them were armed. Some of them were armed with guns that were not theirs. Some of them had drugs. Some of them had drugs that were not theirs, that were planted on them. Like, all it came out in cases later. But it became very apparent that, like, the only way to prevent the police, certain police, especially in Louisville, from killing people was to intervene.
Okay.
And that was like, that, I know this book is like, you shouldn't use facts, and talking about facts is like a difficult thing because it puts people in a position where then they have to defend a belief against a fact. But like, that was like a fact that for sure happened. That's in the records. I never once answered a call to go to a white male ages 18 to 45 to make sure they didn't shoot them. Because it wasn't what the program was after. Cop Watch was a San Francisco-based program, and it basically spread across the country, and it was aimed at reducing the number of deaths from traffic stops by police, of black males specifically. I think it grew to be other things. But the fact that that even existed was shocking to me and telling.
Yeah.
I don't know how, for me, it affected me, I think, because it gave me a perspective of why it's necessary to do certain things to prevent people from being brutalized or killed by the police. Mm-hmm. And in this one particular area and instance, it was mostly black males of a certain age range that were being brutalized and murdered, like, by the police. And the question would be, why do the police murder black men? Mm-hmm. Why do they murder anybody? Mm-hmm. I guess is the question.
That's certainly one of the questions.
I guess that would be the better question, is why do they murder anybody? They're not supposed to.
Sure. I mean, I think that's a good question, but I also think another question would be, first off, and I was thinking about this, listening to you talk specifically about shootings. I'm curious about your own experience with guns. Have you ever shot a gun?
Yes. Yeah, I grew up shooting guns.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you have an understanding of ballistics.
Yes.
How bullets work, how once they penetrate the body, they can deflect through the tissues and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes redirect to other parts of the body than where they impacted. So, what always comes to mind with me, when talking about police shootings, is people say, well, why didn't the cop just shoot him in the leg or shoot him in the arm? Okay,
Sure.
Well, yeah, but we have this idea about ballistics and the way shootings play out. That's presented in media, but shooting someone in the leg is no guarantee that it's non-lethal.
Hit the arterial artery, it's
over,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Exactly.
Right. But shooting somebody once to try and prevent them from harming you as a police officer is, if that goes wrong, fine. Shooting somebody 18 times in the back
Oh, I agree.
is very hard to come back from in the public's eye.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know if it's true that white males are killed more often than black males by police with firearms, then I don't know why that isn't brought up more, but it just seems to fall into the public's purview more when it is
Can I make
black males.
Oh, sorry for.
Yeah.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
It comes from Shelby Steele, this suggestion, who's a well-known author and also has some films out. He recently came out with a film with his son, Eli Steele, all about the Michael Brown case.
Right.
Now, this is partly what I think BLM started a little before that, if I remember correctly, but certainly got some momentum from that, and Al Sharpton was certainly a part of that, and it was a big case, right? This is where Hands Up, Don't Shoot comes from. The film is called What Killed Michael Brown, and there's a concept that Shelby Steele calls poetic truth, and this concept is that the poetic truth that is often told by mainstream media proffers certain, it changes or alters facts to a degree that fit a narrative. That's really the bottom line. So most people don't know that Michael Brown had just attacked the cop. He was robbing a store, right? And then he attacked the cop, and then he ran away, but then he turned around and started running back. All of the evidence suggests that this is the case, and he was, unarmed. But this is, I think we all agree it's egregious to shoot someone in the back multiple times. That's just disgusting. But his life, according to him and according to the evidence, suggests that he was under a real threat, the police officer. So Shelby Steele posits that this is a poetic truth, that there were certain misrepresentations of what happened, and then that blew up, and because it fits a narrative, then it takes off. So that's just throw that out there for you.
Yeah. It seems to me, and obviously, I think we can both agree, shooting someone in the back 18 times is egregious, and definitely there's that can be seen, I think, rightfully so, as an act of burning hatred. At the same time, I wonder, is there I hate to even use such clinical language, but is there an acceptable range that, given a situation where there is a perceived immediate threat, and a person, let's say a police officer, only has 3 seconds to take a decision and take appropriate action, how many shots and where are those shots delivered? What is that? Where's the range where that becomes acceptable? Is it 2 shots center of mass? Is it 3 shots center of mass? How do we come to that consensus culturally?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I think if you are going to arm a population that is dedicated to protect the majority of the population, they should be trained, heavily trained, on how to deal with situations like that don't end in the abuse of something like a firearm or your knee choking somebody for 8 minutes. I think that there should be a larger conversation about how to deal with these threats that don't end in murder. Yeah. You're from England.
I agree.
The Bobbies don't have guns, right? Your typical police officer in England does not carry a gun.
That's correct.
Do you... Because I actually don't know. I haven't, So do you think that there's less violent crime in England?
No, because especially on the streets of London, what we had was stabbings and this thing called happy slaps, which is basically just, kids walking up to some unsuspecting bloke on the street and punching him in the back of the head and knocking him out just for fun. So no, there's certainly not less violence. It just takes a completely different form.
Right.
The violent impulse, we're talking about getting into the human psyche and excising something that's been there since our earliest days of our evolution as a species. I don't necessarily think that removing firearms from the equation is going to solve violence. It certainly might. Maybe you can make the case that it would lead to less lethality,
Yeah.
but then people just switch to knives. People switch to other weapons, tasers, things that can also do a lot of damage. A taser is a non-lethal weapon, but if you happen to tase someone who's got a pacemaker or some other medical device or a condition that might make them more susceptible to the effects of a taser than an average person, they could die from that. So even something non-lethal can still kill.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that's more about the intention, the culture, and the situations as they arise. That is, I think, more apt for discussion, really.
Right. And I guess the other question it begs too do you think it's damaging to the psyche of the country to have, at this moment, the discussion aimed towards mostly Black lives, and protecting them, as opposed to the greater whole of, let's say, the people involved with or subject to police brutality?
No, that's a really good question. I have to say, I've given this a lot of thought. And I certainly agree with the sentiment of the statement, Black Lives Matter, but I also agree with the sentiment that life matters. I don't want anyone getting killed. I don't want people getting hurt unnecessarily.
Right.
I believe in self-defense, obviously. And I think that a conversation around our relationship to violence as a culture and as human beings is definitely important. And while I understand the history in this country pursuant to policing, I'm very much of the mindset that we need to eliminate race from the discussion as much as we possibly can and just get back to dealing with each other as human beings and dealing with the root causes of violence in certain communities around the country, because then we can have a more nuanced discussion around why it's happening. Is it happening because of media? Is it happening because of poverty? Is it happening because of a cultural mindset? Those are conversations that we're not really having. And we're sort of excusing, I think, a criminal mindset, let's say, in certain segments of society and making that almost an essentialist characteristic of their authentic identity, and then saying they can have that, and on top of that, we need to change the way that we engage with them from a policing standpoint. I find that quite patronizing.
You think
and
race
troubling.
has taken over too much of the discussion?
I think so.
Do you think that there might be a reason that that's true? Given just...
I do. I think it's taken over too much of the discussion because there are people who benefit and profit off of it, and I'm talking mainly about politicians, and I'm talking about people, in high profiles within society who profit from the grievance industry, and they profit from the cycle of victimization that we're seeing in the culture.
Right. Do you think it's also possible that it includes, because there are a large number, I'm just making this up, or you can prove me wrong, please, but do you think that there's a large number of white nationalists that end up in the police force and end up taking out their beliefs and their ability to be armed human beings and to protect themselves by shooting somebody? Do you think that could also be why race comes up so often
I think there are some.
in the discussion? Yeah.
I think there are definitely some. I wonder about the degree to which it's as pervasive in the police forces throughout the country as it's been presented by the media. The media would have you believe that we're talking 70%, 80% of these rabid white nationalists. I don't think that's true. I don't know how you even statistically prove it. But I would say, let's put it in the realm of 25%. I don't think it's an overwhelming majority. I really don't. I've had a lot of positive interactions with police. I've had some negative ones too, but I've never been in a situation where I felt in danger simply by coming into contact with a cop. And also too, on top of that, I've always maintained this mindset of just be civil, be Just be a rational, calm, clearly thinking individual when engaging with the police. Don't do anything stupid. Don't be an idiot. Don't posture. If the police officer is treating you badly, get their badge number and report them to their superior. Something may be done about it. Something may not be done about it. But when you're having those engagements, you do everything possible to de-escalate and minimize risk. And I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation. Unless there are, drugs or other things involved. I can see someone in their right mind is not going to approach it with that within that framework.
I really want to ask you a question, but it kind of puts you on the spot.
Go for it.
You're just such a wonderfully philosophical person. You might be the exact person to answer this question for me. And it's out of things that you just said. So do you think a woman in Boston who has a 6-year-old boy, both black, her teaching him that he's not allowed to go into convenience stores wearing hoodies or go into a bank later in life like wearing a hoodie because of fear of being profiled, potentially killed, do you think she's overreacting?
No, I don't. I don't think she's overreacting. I think that she has her own perception of the reality in which she's living, and she's making a very rational calculation around the degree of risk that she and her children are exposed to, and she's very appropriately cautioning them to ensure that they behave appropriately given that risk. Those are the times in which we live. I completely understand that, and I would never call that an overreaction. I think it's sad that those kinds of conversations need to be had. How do we change that? I guess my naive fool's hope is that the culture that facilitates that kind of environment will change.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would never tell that woman that she was overreacting. No.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. It was just a curiosity. Yeah.
It's an excellent question. Yeah.
Yeah, and Travis, this is all very good, and I appreciate sort of where you want to go with this, but I think to a certain degree, I know that we're talking about having impossible conversations, but to a certain degree, I'm not qualified to answer some of these questions. I think that that's something I should be at least allowed to say, probably.
Yeah.
I know we want to have conversations, but there are certain things that I don't think I should broach necessarily at this moment.
That's fair. I mean, I feel like this conversation has gone really well. And
which is great. No. Actually, I
was
really
just gonna
appreciate the question, but as far as when we start talking about statistics of black men murdered in this country without me having, I can't, it's hard for me to speculate on things that have some potential fact aligned with them when it's also a philosophical question.
Right.
I feel like we'd have to separate the two. It either needs to be a conversation about facts and about what's actually happening, or a philosophical conversation that can go down a road of what do we think humanity should look like? That's something easier to talk about than
right.
aligning it with facts, because
Well,
you can get into trouble real fast with this doc if we go down.
Well, I want to second that, because I also feel unqualified to have the factual statistical conversation for the exact same reasons. I don't have those to hand. I don't have an instinctual command of the numbers in that way. I also feel very comfortable sticking to the philosophical discussion myself.
Yeah.
So you're not alone in that regard.
Which is, I think if we change it to what if a person doing this is bad or wrong is perfect, but if it turns into trying to sort of speculate numbers or come up with marginalizing people and figuring out which one deserves more than the other to some degree, I don't know that I can have that conversation well I can try, but I'll need like half a bottle of whiskey.
No, I understand what you're saying, and I wanted to give you both the last word just to see, Eric, if you had anything else to say, or Corey, and then we can wrap up.
I mean, Corey always finishes the conversation so well. I feel like you just walk away after that. Like, just drop the mic and leave, man. Like,
Fair enough.
I can't think of anything right now.
All right.
There's a lot more that we could get into, but the whole gun thing is crazy. But that's like
you're sort of missing. And
3 hours.
One, you said that people were angry when you took pictures of. Who is that?
People within the group. I had I had conversations with BLM. I actually went through a deep dive of like talking to Magnum photographers, talking to like people in the BLM movement, talking to activists, people who were there on the street who asked for money when I photographed them, and people who were being overprotective of some people that I photographed, or who thought they were being photographed by coming up to me and being like, "You can't photograph this person." And I was like, "I'm pretty sure I can. They're in a public space. We're all here for the same reason, I think. Like, I'm not exploiting them. If they don't want to be exploited, they shouldn't be in a public space with 10,000 other people." Like, it was a varying group of people. And then after that, it was longer discussions of who has the right to the movement, and who has the right to document it, and who has the right to express it and show it for what it is. And some people didn't think that I had that right, which is fair and fine and a long conversation. But yeah, I disagreed, but
Right.
I always give people a chance to prove their point.
Evan, anything else?
Cool. I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Travis sent me a podcast interview with this police officer. I think he was a former police officer, but he'd served for a number of years, and he was just saying that whenever he would draw his weapon, like you're absolutely supposed to be prepared to kill your assailant.
Yes.
Like you're not like trying to fire a warning shot or maim them. Like if you're at that level of an altercation, like you should be ready to kill. And how do you think that is as like a mindset for police?
Do you already want me
Please,
to say that?
no, go for it, because I think it's kind of in your question initially anyways.
A bit, yeah. No, it's something I've been thinking of. I mean, obviously, I've never been in law enforcement. I've never been a cop or anything, but I have been trained to shoot. I grew up with firearms. My dad's a gun owner, as am I. And I remember from a very early age, he always said to me, the minute you draw a gun, be prepared to take a life, and don't ever point it at someone unless you are prepared to shoot them. So I think that mindset, I think that's very important, certainly in my experience, because you need to have a degree of discipline and personal responsibility around your use of a firearm. And I think that that's something that sometimes gets lost in the discussion, that there are people who don't respect the fact that they have a firearm in their hands in that moment, and aren't really prepared to take a life with it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question really, mate, but I think also there are people who are just reckless. But still too, I think that when in the moment of crisis, how aware of your ethics can you really be? I think is also the question. Too, when your life is directly threatened, no matter how much training you have. I mean, there's an old story about how during World War II, one of the biggest problems the American infantry had was that a lot of infantrymen would go into situations of combat against the Wehrmacht, and they would never fire a single shot because their moral compass would not allow them to pull the trigger. And so it changed the entire training methodology behind the infantry in subsequent wars, where they were trying to guarantee that men would fire their weapons, so they wanted to turn it into a reflex action and take that moral component out of it.
Right.
How much of that has trickled down into the police force? I wonder if that might be a factor as well.
That's a really interesting point. I'd be amazed if it wasn't.
Yeah, yeah, likewise. Yeah, I think it's very easy to have moral and ethical considerations around how policing should be done, but unless we ourselves are actually in those situations, how can we possibly believe that we could react differently, even if we have the best of intentions and the best training? When your life is directly threatened, or when you have the perception that your life is threatened, I think people go into a fight or flight response.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Which is why I think giving those people weapons of death is probably not necessarily the most promising.
Right.
You're not going to get the most promising result from that.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that it's. This is a gun conversation that will take us 3 hours. to have.
I think let's forego that. But I
Yeah.
just wanted to recap on something. I appreciate both of your ability to navigate these issues carefully and the sensitivity around them. And the point I wanted to make was simply that two things can be true at once. And so we can appreciate what Corey is saying about the individual officer's experience and their ability to react in the moment and sympathize with that. And we can also sympathize with the anecdotes of, so that conversation I sent to Josh, I also sent to Corey, and it was with Daryl Davis. And I got to interview him for my other film. He's one of my heroes. And, his view is based on his experience, his anecdotes. And so both can be true at the same time. I think that the cop in the interview with him was a little too dismissive of his personal experience because he was focusing more on the stats because he's a data guy, and I do get that, and I think that's actually really important. But I also think it's important to acknowledge, like, okay, there's this, Daryl's been roughed up in the back of a police van. That is going to affect the way he views even the stats, and it's an important experience, and it's important to acknowledge that. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. That these are tricky subjects, but I really hope to remind people that again, two things can be true at the same time, and that we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah.
So just a general, I guess, final statement about the conversation. I was nervous as hell going into it. I've never had a conversation like this. I've always been afraid to because, like I said, I always felt like I had so much on the line. And it was just nice to be able to, I guess, as we were digging deeper into these issues and getting more proximal to our personal experiences of these things, I began to feel more and more comfortable. And so I'm just really grateful to actually have had that experience.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been in front of a camera before, so there's that. But no, it's true. Yeah, I don't think it ever really had trouble having conversations with people. People can make it difficult, but I think in this particular instance, well, obviously, it's just nice to see you. But yeah, in this particular, it's almost easier, I find, to have difficult conversations if you have them with somebody you respect.
Right. Yeah.
And who you want to still be friends with afterwards.
Agreed.
Totally.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you'd like to see more of my work, you can head on over to Locals, which is an awesome free speech platform that won't take down or flag any videos, which YouTube is known to do. It's a great platform because people want to be there and they'll engage in meaningful dialogue with you, and it's awesome. Plus, if you sign up for a paid account, you can get access to content that is exclusive to Locals. You'll find a link for that in the description below. Also, if you ever see me lying down in interviews or in any of the videos, it's because I lived with debilitating back pain for years, so I just wanted to explain that so you understand what's going on. And sometimes my little dog Nora might make an appearance. Nora, come here. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. All right, thanks everybody.